long story. Basically, a lot of us come from. Sorry, give me a second. Let's see. Okay, welcome back to the Diaspora podcast. We are honored and privileged today to have Pastor Jake Dell join us today. Pastor Jake, welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so just to kind of give a little bit of an introduction, you're a pastor who moved across lines. You were originally in New York State, New York City, I think, at one point as well, and you're over in Connecticut now at First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Also moved denominational lines as well.
Yes, and actually, just to kind of start us off, I wanted to talk to you, and I was really encouraged by the discussion that you had with John over at Conversations That Matter about a month ago. You had covered a lot of good territory on what you're doing up there in Connecticut right now on confronting some of the great evils that are going on there in the state, and even within what claims to be the church. And I guess just to start off with for our audience, because I've actually asked Reformed pastors this of other denominations, and just wanted to get a take from you. Like when we hear about the Congregational Church, a lot of us think back to like the 17th century. We think back to like or colonial days. What's been going on with the colonial, or sorry, with the Congregational Church, over the last 125 years since the start of the 20th century? Because my only kind of intersection with it has been finding out that my favorite president, John Calvin, was a Congregationalist. But you don't hear much about that denomination today.
That's right. Well, it's a good question you're asking because there's congregationalist polity and then there's the denomination, for lack of a better word, and people can get confused by that. I would say the majority of American congregations in this country are congregationalist, and because that's their polity, they are independent churches. Congregationalism, as it pertains to what happened in New England and the descent from the Puritans, is slightly more nuanced. My own church was founded in 1659 as an ecclesiastical society, which predates the actual organization of the church because the settlers. Consociations of churches and ministers that more or less acted as presbyteries. They would do the functions of taking men under care for ordination. They would call ordination councils. They would invest ministers in their pulpits. But at the same time, they never quite went over to Presbyterianism. And each congregation maintains to this day its local autonomy and its absolute right to determine its worship, its doctrine, and to call its members and to determine criteria, sorry, to call its minister and to determine criteria for membership. So, to answer your question directly, in the last 125 years, what we've seen is the consociations give way to the church ecumenical movement, the church merger movement of the 20th century. And that's where a denomination like the United Church of Christ comes in, which was established in 1957. And a large percentage of Congregationalist churches joined the UCC, but by no means all. There are two other Congregationalist bodies, the North American Conference, Congregationalist Christian Conference, and then the Conservative Congregationalist Christian Conference, both of which I think predate the United Church of Christ. So between the three of those, you have uh, a grouping of the Congregationalist churches that, in many cases, can trace their heritage back to the Puritan colonization, Puritan settlement. Is that a long way of answering your question? I hope that was clear.
Oh yeah, no, that was wonderful. Thank you. I said like it's kind of interesting because like I come from the other side of the border in Canada, the real other
Mhm.
side of the border, and like I said, even I was having trouble, even though I had been visiting New England fairly regularly over the years prior to COVID. That you don't see much activity from congregational churches, but sounds like there's still at least a healthy body of believers, associated with the congregational movement, and that's wonderful to hear. Um, I guess the other question I had as well is like you brought up like the United Church of Christ and how many congregational churches kind of got absorbed into that movement. Being from Canada, we had a kind of a similar thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the United Church of Canada at all.
Yes.
Yeah, and how would you rate like because I think I know the answer, but I wanted to get your take on it. How would you rate the United Church of Christ here in the States versus the United Church of Canada as far as its scale of kind of wokeness and liberality?
So I find it very ironic that I'm now pastoring a church that's affiliated with the United Church of Christ, because back when I was an Episcopalian, we always referred to the United Church of Christ as Unitarians considering Christ, because as liberal and as progressive as the Episcopal Church was, we could always look to the UCC and say, well, we haven't gone that far yet. I think what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, though, is that the Episcopalians have caught up with the UCC, and the UCC has gone completely over the edge. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the conservative constituencies in these denominations have largely been defeated. And I think that's the word. There was an outright war against us, and in desire really to purge us, if and that was a difficult moment for a lot of us to live through. So I think that on the wokeness scale, it probably doesn't get much more woke than the UCC. That having been said, there are, to this day, and my church is one of them, many conservative, or at least conservative leaning, or certainly not radically progressive congregations left. Bob Thompson, who is president of Faithful and Welcoming Churches, which is an organization within the United Church of Christ, he believes that there's up to 30-40% of the congregants in the pews of the UCC churches probably voted for Donald Trump, right? So there's a significant constituency there that is not represented by the leadership of the conferences or the associations, or even the pulpits. Uh, so I think you always have to take these things with a grain of salt. There are a lot of people in the pews who don't appreciate the direction the leadership has taken the church.
Okay, and when you're saying like like that, there's a lot of members in the pews that are maybe kind of and I won't say misaligned, but like just kind of there's a gap between where people are in the pews in a lot of cases and where church leadership is. How many churches are in that association that you have right now?
Well, in the association, again, in Connecticut, these were organized by county over 250 years ago. And I think at this point, there's probably about a dozen or more in the current association that my church is part of. And you've seen attrition over the years. Churches have left the association and, gone independent or joined another, like the Four Cs, another conservative body, or they've closed. And that's something we have to deal with, is that a lot of these churches are closing, or are going to close.
Yeah, no, for sure. But at least it sounds like you're not alone at this point. I know that's a huge thing
Yeah,
to have,
not alone,
especially.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, and as I said earlier, like you had a great conversation with John over at Conversations That Matter. I think back in July. About some of the things that have been happening. Can you just give us a quick recap of what kind of triggered this back in June. Your fight with the state, and all of the well wishes that you've gotten in the last month from via text message ever since.
You're talking about the what happened with the attorney general, or what was the?
Yeah,
Okay,
what led the attorney general basically
I see.
to
Okay,
try
yes.
to open an investigation against you?
Right. Okay. So what happened there is that a news outlet called Project Veritas, which is known for, what you might call gonzo journalism, which is, going after really sensational stories and using tactics like putting up undercover reporters posing as minor children uh, to really kind of go after what they consider grievous offenders of public morality, or and what they try to expose hypocrisy in high places is probably a good way to put it. So they haven't earned themselves very many friends in the establishment. And one of the stories they broke earlier this summer was of pastors, or at least one pastor in Connecticut in the Hartford area, who allegedly was counseling minor children to receive chest binders, um, calling the Department of Children and Family Services, uh, again on a mother who was opposing her son's transition to, or daughter's transition to, a man. And these would be straight up and down examples of a pastor or of a church breaking the law. In Connecticut, we have a constitution, a state constitution, that provides for freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, provided that your free exercise of religion doesn't hurt the public. So there's a clause in there about, churches you're free to join a church, whatever church you want, provided the church isn't engaged in or promoting licentious behavior. So there was a concern by the framers of the Constitution to protect public morals. And then also provided that your church is not actively harming the public. So you could see how this would be used against cults. You could see how it would be used against, back in the 19th century, what were called free love societies. And that's when the Connecticut Constitution, when that clause was inserted in the 19th century. I think there was concern, originally targeted at Unitarians or other groups that would be considered contrary to public morals, or engaged in licentious behavior. And I would say that clause of the Constitution has sat dormant for decades, right? I can't remember the last time I've seen the state open an investigation against a church for public indecency. Well, I thought, here you've got a pretty open and shut case of a church in the Hartford area. If it's promoting minor gender transitions, which is against the law, and without parental consent, then this is not only licentious behavior, but it's harming the public as well. So I rather, pointedly said in a sermon and then online, to the Attorney General of Connecticut, that he ought to investigate this, and gave him the constitutional reason why he should. And I went on a few radio programs, and two state senators also supported me in this, sent a letter to the Attorney General asking him to investigate. He never got back to me, but he got back to the senators. And then I was a little annoyed that he hadn't responded to me. So I sent him another letter saying, why haven't you responded? And I tweeted a copy of my letter asking him to please, respond and to open the investigation. And I used a slogan in that tweet where I said, silence equals death. And I was doing that on purpose, consciously, as a way of kind of feeding back to the progressive movement their own words. In the 80s, they would use the slogan, silence equals death, as a way to say that the state was not taking the AIDS crisis seriously enough. And gay men were dying because of that. And as recently as a month ago, the Episcopal bishops of Connecticut used the slogan, silence equals death, to denounce Israel and its treatment of Palestinians in Gaza. So the phrase silence equals death is a well-worn phrase. It's a phrase liberals and progressives coined and have loved to use. And they only use it when it suits them and when they want to shine light on one of their pet causes. So I decided, well, I'll use that phrase in my tweet to shine light on this cause, which I think is quite serious. And he decided, he took that as the opportunity to have the state police detective give me a call and ask me to clarify what I meant by that phrase because it was perceived as being threatening. So I clarified in the way that I've just done to you, and the case was dismissed. But it was nevertheless rather chilling. We hear about things going on in the United Kingdom, and I suppose even in Canada, where it's against the law to stand silently and pray in front of an abortion clinic. So they're even attempting over there to police your thoughts. Well, when that comes home to roost here in this country, which was established on an absolute principle of freedom of speech, it's a bit frightening.
Yeah, no, no, for sure, and that does remind me as I'm listening to what you're sharing, of exactly what is happening in Canada right now, and that has been escalating. It's been escalating really across the whole what we call the Commonwealth.
Mhm.
Canada, Australia, UK. I know you guys have a different definition up there in New England for that,
Right.
but yeah, no, that's crazy that that the Attorney General Tong had gone and done that to you. Now, since that's happened, and first of all, I'm happy that the police rightly saw the need to dismiss the case. I think they said it was a non-criminal event, is I think what the
That's
text
right.
said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, does this not fall into the category of like First Amendment retaliation though, where like
Well, I don't know
you're
what you
yeah.
mean by First Amendment retaliation, but I would say that it, maybe you want to clarify what you mean by that,
Yeah,
before I
and
answer.
yeah, sure. And I'm not a lawyer for the record, but you see it a lot on a lot of the police interaction videos that are online, where someone will make a comment, say to an officer, in some cases, and then the officer decides he's going to pull over the person,
Mhm.
just because I need to investigate. I think I smell something in your car or something along those lines. And there's been a lot of court cases, as far as I understand it, where if it's shown that you say something to a public official, which in this case you clearly have, and then all of a sudden you're being investigated, that would fall under a First Amendment retaliation case
I
where the
see.
public official has overstepped their authority and actually violated your First Amendment rights.
Right. Well, I think it certainly looks like that, and the fact that it didn't go any further may mean that it, you know, isn't that because, but I took it as as an attempt to silence me or to intimidate me, um, and so I certainly took it that way.
Yeah, no, for sure, and just to kind of get a sense of the gravity of the situation, because I can hear even within some quarters of the church, people saying, "Well, why are you making a big deal out of this? This is another
Mhm.
church that is wackadoodle. It's gone off the rails. Why even bring this to the attention of the government?" I was reading up on this. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of the activity that has been going on with these chest binders and that. Uh, you know, you can't make a direct correlation, but perhaps an indirect correlation that some of these one girl in particular, I think, went on to um, basically end her life over the
Mhm.
situation. Is that accurate?
In the two videos that Project Veritas released, the second video profiles a mother, Elvira Saeed, whose daughter committed suicide. And the allegation was that this minister called the Department of Children and Family Services on the mother, uh, and was involved in that scenario somehow. Uh, so that's the extent of what was, I think, shown by that video. Um, but yes, that my understanding is that that child took her own life.
Yeah, so this is a matter of like just again, if we put it in terminology of like Matthew 21 and the two great commandments, this is loving our neighbor in this case, right?
Well, it is, and what struck a nerve with me is if you look at that second Project Veritas video where the mother Elvira Said is being interviewed, one of the first things she says is this in the Christian Bible? Because she's a Muslim. And she, her appeal is, how is this Christian? How is a Christian minister doing this? And that goes back, I think, to the constitutional argument here. A Christian minister shouldn't be doing this. And the Constitution of the state of Connecticut has a proviso that would limit Christian ministers who do this. This is licentious behavior, and it's a threat to public order and safety. The idea that one can just do whatever he wants, or say whatever he wants, or preach whatever he wants, under the color of First Amendment religious privilege, I think that's never been the understanding, the constitutional understanding, either for federally or with regard to a state like Connecticut.
Yeah, no, no, for sure. And let me just kind of look at, because again, I'm sure you've probably come across, these criticisms, or people that have objected to, like what you're doing, for example, right now, by saying, no, no, this is wrong. This needs to be investigated. We need to get Caesar involved in this, because that's
Right,
his
right. I
role
see
in
where
this
you're going.
case.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, I come myself from a covenantal background, and
Hmm.
we know, amongst all of the different covenantal traditions, that there is this idea of, kind of the separation of powers. It's
Sure.
family, state, and church, and the state is responsible, as you rightly said, to protect life. But then you can have, some people come along and say, well, hold on a minute, if that's the state's job, then what are you as a minister doing? And even more so, you know, you got to be careful, because if you're going to sick the state on a guy who is trying to basically corrupt young girls, which just sounds like what's happening here, uh, what's stopping the state, as we've seen, as we've mentioned in other countries, from saying, well, you're a threat to public safety for, again, I'll use an example from Canada. As a minister, the law up there states that you can't even recommend that a young boy who thinks that he's a girl. Right. So,
Right.
how would we respond to that kind of argument, that we just need to kind of stay in our lane and kind of not attract attention to ourselves, lest it be turned against us?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think one thing that comes to my mind is the idea of counterfeit currency, right? Why do we care about counterfeit currency? Why does the state care about counterfeit currency? Because it dilutes the money supply, right? Why do we care about trademarks and copyright? Why do we care about branding? Why do I sue if you use a brand or a trademark that I own, or if you copy my product and sell it, make it cheaply and sell it cheaply? Why do I sue? Because you're robbing my product, my brand, of its value. Well, the same is true with the gospel, right? So this minister in Hartford, Connecticut, who is openly teaching licentious doctrine and corrupting public morals and contributing to public disorder, Elvira Said's, the very words out of her mouth as a Muslim, convict the Christian church. She asks, is this Christianity? And the answer, of course, is no, it's not. And so not only does the state have an obligation, as it does with commercial products and patents and trademarks, or with currency, but it also has an obligation in the Connecticut Constitution, straight letter law, black and white law here, to protect the church. We can talk about other polities, other commonwealths, other states. I don't know what the law in Canada would be, or certainly in other states out in the union. But in Connecticut, I think, owing to our religious history that goes way back, as we were talking about earlier in the podcast, this was a colony, and then later a state, that had an established church for over 200 years. And when when the church was disestablished, it was done somewhat reluctantly. The vote was fairly close. And I think this provision was put into the Constitution in 1818, when it was disestablished, as a consolation to the former establishment and to the concerned ministers, that we weren't entering into a free-for-all after disestablishment, that we weren't going to have a public uh, wheel, a commonwealth, that where anything goes. And so we do have these constitutional principles. Christians do, at least in a state like Connecticut, still have a constitutional backstop that they can use. Now, I don't really expect an attorney general like ours to use it in that way, which I think brings us to the second question you're asking, which is this one of, well, if they use it against the bad guys, won't they use it against us? And the answer, I have two answers to that question. First of all, what do you think they've been doing to us for the last 60 years? Secondly, didn't it become extremely obvious what they are doing to us since 2020? So they don't care about law or First Amendment or separation of powers. They don't care about any of the things that we care about. They're going to abuse power because that's what they do. And Jesus says these things must come: persecution, wars, famine. If the church is persecuted, the church is persecuted. But that's in a different category than the state, the Christian magistrate, using constitutional power and authority to police churches that are counterfeit, that are preaching a counterfeit gospel.
Yeah, and no, that's what well put. And I guess kind of what you're saying is that like we have to in the church particularly, but I would argue maybe in the broader kind of non-woke sector of society today's, which I think is growing because of how things have gone. We have to realize that our opponents are basically quite happy and quite willing to fight dirty. They'll use, like you said in your tweet situation, they'll use phrases like violence or silence is violence. You know, just to kind of guilt you into going along with their plan. But as soon as you turn a mirror on their own activity, then all of a sudden they're going to come after you again just for doing that as well. Is that
Right.
fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say, and that's exactly how I've experienced them for the last 30 years, and it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this kind of, I guess, brings us into another aspect of this conversation that I wanted to cover because, as I'm sure you know, like, I'm always careful with this phrase. I want to preface this and say, when you hear the term Christian nationalism, that's a
Mhm.
huge debate going on in the church right now. And part of it is because, to the best of my understanding, this isn't a phrase that we came up with ourselves. It's not like the church got together and had a doctrinal statement or some kind of uh, you know association get together and say, okay, well, this is what we want to define it as. We've adopted it because our opponents came up with it, and then we've kind of taken it and tried to reinterpret it. Um, I'm kind of intrigued with what you shared, in other discussions on the history of Connecticut, and which you just kind of alluded to here, with the preference that Christianity got within the colony and then in the state of Connecticut, and just wanted to kind of ask a few questions about that. And so I
Sure.
guess, yeah, the first one on that is when your state constitution, when the documents either currently or in previous versions refer to this special status for the Christian church, was that defined? Because I've watched a number of historical theology videos, like history at the church kind of things, and they'll talk about, like, you'll have the Quakers come along. You brought up, like, I think the Universalists up in Massachusetts. Um, like, because someone can come along, as you just noted, and say, "Oh, I'm a Christian," and have absolutely nothing to do with anything, related to Scripture, Christ, anything else. Does the state constitution or the legal documents that govern your state have anything to say about that, on what defines a Christian? Like, they have to be Trinitarian. Let's start there and move on from that, or
So
how does that handled?
Connecticut's known as the Constitution state because we are we have what was believed to be the first written constitution in Western civilization. So I know we have the Magna Carta, but the fundamental orders of Connecticut were adopted in the 17th century, in the 1600s, to govern the colony. And we call that was our original constitution, and we call that historically the first constitution in the West, written constitution in the West. That was explicitly Christian, and I'd have to go and check it to see if it actually spells out the Trinity, but I think Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were certainly understood in one's profession of Jesus Christ as Lord. That required a profession of Christian faith, of its, you know, office holders, and consciously constituted the colony as a Christian body politic. That constitution gave way in 1818 to the 1818 Constitution, which among other things, sort of caught the state up with the fact that we were no longer a colony, but also disestablished the church. And the disestablishment was replaced with Article 1st, Section 3, which you could argue established a form of civil Christianity. So Christianity was still presumed, and I stress the word presumed, to be the religion of the people, of the body politic. But there were no tests for office in the 1818 Constitution. Those were eliminated. Establishment was eliminated, so there was no more taxing of the population to support the church. And that's really all establishment ever was in Connecticut. We didn't have anything like the House of Lords or the Bishop's Bench or anything like that. And so, but if you read the 1818 Constitution, the presumption is that only Christians have the right to the free exercise of religion. Only Christians have the right to organize themselves into churches. And what the 1818 Constitution does is say that the state washes its hands of any sectarian controversy or policing. We're not, in other words, if you're a Baptist or you're an Episcopalian or you're a Congregationalist or you're a Methodist, you are perfectly free to organize your own ecclesiastical society as a free association of people to tithe, to take up subscriptions, to raise money for your support, and to go about your business, buy and sell property, conduct yourself in our civil order. The fact that it was presumed to be Christian is made clear in 1843, I think that's the year, when the Connecticut State Legislature passes a law to allow Jews to have the same privilege. That is to say, it was not immediately assumed by the Connecticut Constitution of 1818 that anyone other than Christians had the right to organize religious societies. So the 1843 law made a special case for Jewish worship. That continued until 1965, when the Connecticut Constitution was rewritten. And in 1965, it makes it explicit that freedom of religion under Article 1st, Section 3 does not have to be Christian. That Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, theosophical, any organization that is religious can organize itself along the lines as a religious organization, organize itself along the lines as a church. So you can see that the scale is moving in a certain direction. But it's interesting to me that until 1965, it was not explicit in law, constitutional law in Connecticut, that non-Christian religious societies were protected in the same way that Christian religious societies were. That's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, this is great. I mean, because again, we don't hear about this, and I think that again, especially with the Christian nationalism debate going on right now, there's a lot of back and forth about hypotheticals. Whereas what I'm hearing from what you've been sharing over the summer in your various interviews is that it looks like in this country, there's been a history of actually having some kind of formal recognition in law of Christianity and the Christian church, right? And things didn't go to the full extreme of having like a Christian Caesar, right? That
Right.
was going to be a draconian ruler, and I guess that leads me to my next question is, how did this work in practice, particularly in that maybe middle section, between the beginning of the 19th century with that first change and then the change that happened in the 1960s? Was Connecticut the kind of place where, you mentioned that there was a special provision given for Jewish synagogues, but was it a kind of place that if you showed up and you were Muslim, that you were ostracized and it was made clear you were not welcome here? Maybe can you speak to what life was like?
Well, I think the real life example we have in New England and certainly in Connecticut is the massive Roman Catholic immigration, much more than Jewish or Muslim or any other kind of immigration or religious group. Dealing with Roman Catholics, I think, stressed the system changed the settlement in ways that the framers of the 1818 Constitution couldn't possibly have imagined, right? In 1818, the assumption was Protestant Christian. They didn't have to say that because that was the assumption. Fast forward 60, 70 years, and you're dealing with massive Roman Catholic immigration, particularly in the cities of Connecticut. Waterbury, Connecticut rivals any city in Europe for the number and beauty and quality of its churches, Roman Catholic churches. Uh, they're exquisite. So I think that stressed the system and taxed the settlement and created in many ways the political reality that we still have today, where you had urban rural divide. And before the opening of the interstate highways, in the small towns in Connecticut were small towns, and they were, hard to get to, and things hadn't changed much maybe in 200 years. That the Congregational Church did its thing, the Episcopal Church did its thing, and but if you went into the urban centers, you would see large Roman Catholic and other ethnic, ethnic white settlements really starting to change the politics of the state and the landscape of the state. I'm not so much, I'm going to have to put on my amateur historian's hat here and say that I imagine that the prejudices were everything we're told they were. There was real prejudice against Roman Catholics, Irish, and others. But my impression is, or my understanding of what happened constitutionally and legally, is that that had no impact. In other words, there was no attempt to amend the Constitution and strengthen Protestant Christianity in the state of Connecticut. And I think what you see happening with American Roman Catholics is the Americanization of Roman Catholics, to the extent that they're quite willing to adopt Protestant sensibilities. And the prime example of that is Main Street, Woodbury, where my church sits on the corner of Main Street and Judson Avenue. And I can look right across the street at the Roman Catholic Church, and you would think you're seeing double, because the Roman Catholic Church is built exactly like the Puritan Congregational Church that it was built next to. So that's just one architectural example, I think, of Roman Catholics accommodating themselves to the Protestant ethos and norm. And I think that was done that was probably a wise move on their part, because I think it forced, it staved off any real threat or real effort to amend or change the law or the Constitution that might have made it hostile to Roman Catholicism. I just don't think you see enough Jewish immigration or settlement in a state like Connecticut, outside of a few places, to make much of a difference. I am aware of a kibbutz type movement that took place, not kibbutz, did I say that right? A settlement movement that took place in the early 1920s, where there was an attempt to get Jewish families back to the land and become farmers. And this really took hold in the Levant, in Israel, but there were efforts to do it in Connecticut and New York. And from my friendship with the rabbi in a small synagogue in Dutchess County, where my last church was in New York, he told me that the reason it was established in New York, just over the border from Connecticut, is the Connecticut Yankees were hostile to the Jewish farmers. So
Yeah.
I think that's anecdotally an answer to your question. I think Muslim or Buddhist, we just didn't see those kinds of numbers before, certainly not in 1965 when the Constitution was last amended. But we certainly are seeing them now. The former First Congregational Church of Bridgeport, Connecticut, is now a mosque, and there's a crescent on the top of the steeple. So, it is certainly happening.
Yeah, and this is so interesting what you're sharing here, because I come out of, I was saved out of the Catholic Church, right,
Mhm.
years and years ago, but I know exactly what you're talking about as far as like the Catholic Church in North America, at least in the U.S. and Canada, is very different than what you find in other parts of the world, and I've seen it firsthand. I'm down here in Texas now, and so there's a very large presence of South American Catholic or originated Catholic churches, right? And while we would say that the statues are statues, regardless of who they are, and that there would be a problem there, as far as the idolatry aspect of things. Catholic
Sure.
churches, in the U.S. will emphasize far more, even inside, the Jesus aspect of things over the Mary aspect of things.
Hmm.
Right, for the most part. So, right, you get down here to the south, and I'm presuming it continues even. I've seen it even on some trips, south of the border in the Caribbean. It very much becomes a Mary show, right? So that's fair, and I think it kind of speaks as well to what we've seen happen over the last century. Whereas the Catholic Church is willing, when it needs to be, to accommodate the cultural nuances of an area, right? Especially something like if they come into a Protestant area, they'll emphasize, well, we believe in Scripture too, or we believe that Jesus is
Right.
the only way to salvation. We don't find that with other groups like Hindus, Muslims. That now we're seeing an influx of people coming from countries with those religions instead.
Right.
And I think one thing that needs to kind of be emphasized here is you know you can't have a neutral state that doesn't have any value system whatsoever, right? Just recently, just outside of Toronto, a Hindu temple built the largest Hindu god statue. I think it's 55 feet tall in North America, right?
Right.
So your churches have long been gone in that area for the most part, and it's getting replaced by something else. It's not like it just kind of stays void,
No.
and and that's kind of a warning for us that again, we may say, oh, we don't want the state dealing with anything that's going to be religious, but correct me if I'm wrong. Connecticut's government is still very religious today. It's just not Christian in its orientation anymore.
That's how I experience it. Certainly. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's that alone is worth kind of having this discussion, and kind of seeing even from history where things have gone, maybe what has worked, because we look back on earlier American history and say, okay, well, they had a lot. I know it wasn't perfect by any means, but they seem to have a lot of thoughtfulness into the way that they planned out the system back then. Now, oh, sorry, go ahead. Were
No,
you
I
going
was
to say
going to say, I
something?
think they did. And part of my study of Puritans and of that time period historically is to try to understand what went wrong, right? How did it unravel? And I'm still not quite sure I've figured that out yet.
If you don't mind me testing you a little bit on this, because I've been looking into this question as well, and I remember my church recently went through a Ligonier series on American church
Mhm.
history, and it's just kind of like, yep, it almost felt like Judges. It's like this
Yeah,
generation came along, they served the Lord, and then their kids came along, and they were all heathen, and
right.
that was it. Do you have, and again, I just want to ask, since we're on the topic, do you have any theories on why that was happening? Especially because, in our day and age, we look at like mass media, like there's a lot of strangers that get into our homes these days. There's a lot of
Yes.
strangers that get into our churches. They're sometimes in our pockets while we walk around. What do you think was happening, given the amount of effort that the early settlers had, that they said we wanted to set up a Christian establishment, in the early colonies and then the early states. My understanding, Rhode Island was created because it was a heretics colony. They basically drove people
Right.
out, right,
Right.
to kind of keep things, religiously pure. What do you think was happening that was leading for the faith not transitioning from generation to generation in those early days?
Well, I think you have a couple things going on. I think the Puritans were a unique generation, and Puritanism, I think, lasted about roughly 100 years. And what they were trying to do, establishing a Christian commonwealth was not the novel idea. I mean, Great Britain, England was a Christian commonwealth. All of Europe was Christendom at that point, right? So that wasn't the new idea. The new idea was that Puritans were and this comes out of the Reformation, but the visible church, the regenerate church, that the church ought to be visibly regenerate, and only members who are visibly regenerate should be members of the church. And that's an idea that's still with us today, and certainly uh, important. But that has to be contrasted, I think, with the Anglicanism of the Church of England, the parochialism of the Church of England, which it inherited from the medieval church, which was the idea that this is a Christian country, this is a Christian land. You're Christian because you're born here. You're Christian because your name is entered in the parish register because the clerk, the curate, the priest baptized you when you were 2 weeks old. So, but as the tension between that understanding of a Christian republic and that understanding of a Christian people versus the visibly regenerate one is, I think, where I think you have to look at that for the locus of the breakdown, because that's where it breaks down in the second generation. My church, as I said, was established, organized in the decade between 1659 and 1670. And the first generation were Puritans. They settled in a town called Stratford. They were visibly regenerate. By the time my church is organized, it's organized out of a schism in that Stratford church, because you've got the second generation who aren't having that Puritan experience. They're not having that regenerate experience that they can go to the deacons and the elders of the church and satisfy them with that they've met the criteria for full church membership. So my church was organized as what was called a halfway covenant church. And the more I read about the halfway covenant, the more it strikes me as Anglicanism, as medieval churchianity. It's this idea that you still want the benefit of church membership. You still want the benefit of living in a Christian civil order, because guess what? When you follow God's law, when you are obedient to the law of God, you will prosper. You will realize his blessing. So the halfway covenant allowed for churches to be organized and for members to have a partial membership. They could, be part of the church, have their children baptized, but they were excluded from communion because communion was reserved for the visibly regenerate. And so what I think happened there is that tension, when lingers even after that founding generation dies out. And that's where I think someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne as an author comes along and really explores the hypocrisy that takes over. Because you have people who are outwardly Christian. They want Christian laws. They want to call themselves Christian. They want all the benefits of Christian society. But they secretly, in a story like Young Goodman Brown, they secretly go into the woods in the middle of the night to practice witchcraft, right? So I think what Nathaniel Hawthorne did was explore the psychology of that lingering tension between the regenerate and visible church and the rest of us who want the benefits of Christian civil order, civil society, but we're not up to we're not quite up to snuff. We don't meet the criteria. So I think as that plays itself out over American history, we have successive revivals that come through that seek to sort of revive the visibly regenerate church. And as that happens, that tension persists. And we see an alienation between the visibly regenerate, the fundamentalists, the evangelicals, if you want to call them that, and the rest of society, which is perfectly happy to go to church on Sunday and wants, doesn't want public profanity and doesn't want lewdness and doesn't want gay marriage and doesn't want adultery and doesn't want gambling, doesn't want public drunkenness, doesn't want all of that stuff, but they also don't want to be holy rollers either, right? So this tension, this back and forth plays itself out throughout American history until you get to the advent of the modern era in the 1920s with mass media, mass communication. And then I think you start to see something totally different and alien enter into the bloodstream of our culture. And I'll stop there because that was pretty long-winded, but
No, we appreciate the details here. This is why we do this podcast. So
okay.
this is excellent. And I think what you're describing is like, for most of American history, the tension was with something that we would call nominalism
Right.
in the church. Right. It's like,
Right.
I want the label, but I'm not necessarily going to be paying the membership fees.
Right.
Right. So no, that makes sense. And I think it's a warning as well, because, like we said, we just finished a series earlier this summer on like marriage and the dating crisis, which is wrecking Gen Z right now. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And my attitude towards non-Christians is, hey, look, this is still an institution God has given. You don't have to be Christian to be married,
Right.
but it's going to bring you benefits and blessings because you're still obeying what God has designed us for as human beings if you're entering into that union. But I hope that it at least points you to the fact that, well, if God's right on this, He's right on the rest of it as well. Like we've been raised, anyone I think who's under 50 has been raised in a culture where you're just taught to think that God was wrong on everything, or what
That's
people
right.
thought God said was wrong on everything. I think one of the dangers I'm seeing, and I'll stop this question with just one case because I want to wrap up on some of the other stuff that you're dealing with right now in Connecticut to wrap up here today. But I'm noticing a danger, and I want to get your take on this, where we're seeing a revival of exactly what you were saying, which is I want the benefits of a Christian society. Apparently, even Richard Dawkins, of all people, was
Right.
saying this. And I'm seeing Jordan Peterson, my fellow troublesome Canadian. He's now doing Bible studies where he's using Moses and Jesus as archetypes psychologically, right? And so people want to kind of have that label or that veneer over society, but I'm noticing there's still a reluctance to say, well, I'm actually going to follow it through to its end. Like, it's not just a legal system or a standard of morals, but it's something we would say is fundamentally spiritual, right? You need to be quickened to salvation.
Right.
Um, what's your warning, I guess, for the younger people who came out of a post-Christian society, are rediscovering that maybe our grandparents and great grandparents, some of the rules they had weren't so crazy after all, but aren't willing or are not ready right at that point where they're like, okay, we need to get back to the gospel. We need to get back to actually, having a regenerate relationship with our Lord as our Savior.
Well, my warning to the younger generation would be to um, avoid a radicalism that kind of ideological purity spiral. What do I mean by that? I guess I would say my own. I came of age in the 80s, early 90s as Generation X. So I was a latchkey kid for part of my childhood. My parents were divorced. Uh, I think in a lot of ways, I experienced what this generation is experiencing, but with the volume turned way up, right? So, in order to sort of correct what I thought was the great wrong of my, childhood, I looked back to my grandparents' generation, which was the what we now call the greatest generation, World War II, Great Depression. And my parents hadn't baptized me. They weren't raising me in church, but my grandparents had their children baptized and had raised them in church. And what I mistook was that if I simply adopted the trappings of the good life that my grandparents had lived, go to church, and adopt that sort of middle class mindset that ran right straight through the 1980s, that I too would be able to undo the damage that had been done to me and was being done to my generation. That it was a very simple reset is all that we needed to do. Well, things are a lot more complicated than that. And culturally and socially, we've been through a massive train wreck. I don't think there is a reset. There's no radicalism means to return to the root, right? There's no real root to go back to other than Jesus Christ, right? And he is ever new. So my advice would be to avoid totalizing an institutional solution, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or integralism or Christian nationalism or Christian, a Christian prince. Avoid that kind of totalizing thinking. Have some compassion for the generation that you think messed up, um, because I can guarantee you by the time you hit 40 or 50, you're going to be begging for the same compassion because you're going to mess up yourself. And your generation will be accused by the generation coming along as having failed them. So lean into some grace and some charity and some forgiveness. Work on your relationship with God. Understand your need for forgiveness, for salvation. But at the same time, don't be afraid to be bold. Don't be afraid to call out the injustice. Don't be afraid to stand up to the tyranny, to the tyrants in particular. And you have, I would say this to the upcoming generation, you have every right to expect things should be better, and you have the power to make them better. So go do it.
Yeah, no, and I like that, and I think that last point is something this upcoming generation really wants to do. I mean, they're already seeming to do it, voting with their feet, moving to
Mm-hmm.
different areas, looking at different work arrangements, and so on. Like, and seeking out more of a family arrangement, right? But no, I think that's great. Is what I'm hearing from you is that this isn't again about what the government is doing or what your employer is doing or any other outside institution. This is between you and God, first of all.
Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, no, that's great. And just as I said, to kind of close things out, I did want to talk a little bit. I'll confess, as an accounting and finance nerd, professionally and personally, your discussion around the laws and how non for profits have to deal with giving really kind of interested me, and I wanted to talk a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about that.
Sure.
So you've brought up, and quite rightly, I mean, I'll say this: when I was studying for my CPA exam, it's really emphasized, like, if something's a restricted gift, you can't just take that, if it's going to, pay for even the pastor's new car, right? You can't just take it and say, well, we'd rather use it for the building, even if you think it's going
Right.
to be much better utilized for that purpose. So you've talked about in the more, I guess, colonial parts of the United States on the East Coast, there's a lot of church buildings, a lot of assets, even railroad stocks
Yeah.
um, that these churches will have, that would have come from earlier generations giving. And there may be an avenue to at least see some of those funds, if they're misused to, yeah, as you mentioned, like a church being sold to a Muslim association to build a mosque, that there may be an opportunity to recoup some of those funds for the folks or for their descendants. Can you just kind of give us kind of again a quick recap of how that would work,
Sure.
legally?
So the idea is just as you've said, that with a will or bequest or a gift instrument, there's often a clause, a rider, a proviso that indicates how the gift is to be used. And if it stops there, it stops there. But a lot of them go further and say that dictate the terms by which the gift should be returned, uh, if it's not used that way. So it's really just the idea of donor intent, which, as you say, is an established legal principle. That's easy. That's not the hard thing. The hard thing to do will be to identify these instruments, these gifts, these wills, these bequests. Where are they? The records may be lost in some cases, or as I suspect, they're buried in paper archives all over the place. So it's a question of how do we tap this? Because I suspect it's there. Just my gut tells me when I look at a church that is a beautiful old historic downtown church that has a wonderful legacy, like I'm thinking of one in Connecticut where Jonathan Edwards once was the pastor, flying a rainbow flag. You know that this is off course, that this is not in keeping with the history or the legacy of that institution, right? Question is, the challenge is going to be, how do we establish a legal case to do anything about it? So that's the hurdle. I think we're at a time now in history where it's more plausible to do this than ever. And I have to believe this is the model for litigation going forward, for this kind of litigation, but also for every kind of litigation. And that is, we need to get access to the files. We need to digitize those files, and then we need to use artificial intelligence to find exactly what we're looking for. This now all of a sudden becomes, in the past that was certainly doable, but I think the cost would have been prohibitive, right? You're basically talking about a fishing expedition, the physical problem of getting all of this information together and then paying somebody to go through it. This is the work of PhD grad students, right? And so, but now it can be done at scale for relatively low cost with scanning and artificial intelligence. So that solves one hurdle. The second hurdle, I think, thanks to Ancestry.com and I guess the Mormons, is that the genealogical records now are fantastic, right? You between the two, between going through the archives, digitizing them, scanning them, and using artificial intelligence to find examples of these gifts, bequests, wills, and donor, intent, and then matching them with descendants, you've got the potential here for a real moneymaker. And that's what I want to stress. This has the opportunity to make a law firm a lot of money, because the way a litigation trust works is that you would find, let's say 20, 30, 40, 50,000 potential heirs. You'd say, look, you may be entitled to anywhere from $2 to $200 million. We don't know, but sign over your claim to this trust, and we will do all the legwork for you. And then if there's a settlement, it'll go into a pool of which you'll get a percentage. And the other percentage, it would be used to pay the legal fees and cover the expenses. And then the balance of it, my vision is to use that as a trust to pay for ministers, the training of young men to go into these churches that are on the borderline risk of being closed, and to help them get back on their feet and to send them godly men as their pastors.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I just, as a quick aside, I want to note that, like, we usually talk about artificial intelligence because of all the threats that it can bring, and they are there, right? But at the end of the day, it's just a tool, right?
That's
It can
right.
be used for great evil and for great good. And as you said, it can be used in this case to, help do what is just, right? What
Right.
we would call a biblically just thing for earlier saints and what their intentions were. Because all of us here who are in the church today, when we're giving our offerings, we're not expecting that one day is going to be used to enrich a completely pagan group of people, right?
Right.
And so I think it's quite right there to try to use those tools for that. Um, I guess on that note too, like, I don't know if you've come across this. I think I have over the years. There seems to be, especially in kind of more of the reform circles, this kind of attitude that we have where we just kind of see ourselves as sojourners wandering in the wilderness, like the whole system's against us, and we just kind of have to kind of stay doctrinally pure, walk faithfully before with the Lord, and leave it at that. Um, and as a consequence, we maybe miss opportunities like what you're bringing up here, right? Which is that maybe we do need to kind of pursue this a little bit for making sure that we're not actually aiding the efforts of, false religion that's ultimately going to be, leading people to hell, right?
Right.
And going, the consequences of that being more extreme than anything else that could happen. Um, how would you respond to someone who's like, well, that just seems dirty, right? Like, we're talking about money now. We're talking about law situations. Like, the church shouldn't be involved in that kind of stuff. That seems a little petty or something. How would you respond to someone who would be leveling that criticism against something like this?
Well, it it behind that criticism, I think, is a concern that's legitimate, which is that Christianity is not new. We've got 2,000 years of a track record here, and we can look at the institutions of Christendom, the churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the magisterial Protestant churches, the denominations, the high school, the prep schools, the parochial schools, and the universities, and they've all drifted left and towards progressivism. They've all lost their way, right? So the the instinct or the realization, the conclusion from that is to say, well, this is all a lost cause. This earth is not our home. We're just sojourning here, as you said. And besides, now we have the track record to prove that any effort here is just wasted effort. So, look, there is my response to that is almost like, okay, so what? You've got to still try, right? You've got for a number of reasons. One is that it goes back to the counterfeit example that I described earlier. Elvira Said asked the question, is this what the Christian Bible teaches? Is this what Christian ministers promote? And the answer is no. So we have an obligation to our Lord's honor to put out the truth about him and to go after those who lie about him. The tools that we use, we can have an honest debate about which ones will be effective. But I don't think we can say that we are free from any obligation to defend our Lord. That is absolutely what we need to do. The defense of the gospel. Jude talks about this. I would rather be, enjoy a spiritual time of communion with you, but I've got to contend for the faith,
Hmm.
So the witness to what I'm trying to do here is apostolic, right? It's biblical. Paul spent his life doing this. He would have much rather gone and be with Christ. There were many things he would have liked to have written to, and discussed with him, but he has to go back and build the foundation again, right? So that we're always going to be doing that, because I think that is the nature of our fallen human, of nature of life after the fall, and in this time. So I think that I understand the concern, but I also think that we should return to the use of an old word, the church militant, and that's what we're here to do on earth. We're here earning not our salvation, but we are earning our crown. And this is the means that God gives us to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think one of the ways that I've kind of come to think of it in my mind as I've watched this manifest in different ways. I mean, COVID was a good example of this, I think, too, right? Where all the stuff that wasn't even found in Scripture all of a sudden found its way into quote unquote Scripture. As
Mhm.
churches were reacting to things, is there's a huge difference between being nice to somebody and being kind to somebody,
Right.
right? And niceness, actually, I would argue, the more I kind of dwell on this, is that it's actually part of the hypocrisy that Jesus confronted with the Pharisees, right? In the Gospels, right? It's that you put on an air or a show, to kind of make it look like, well, aren't we doing such good work here by, whatever it is, whether that's like, not singing hymns on Sunday because they didn't want us to sing hymns, or you know, in this case, like we're not going to get into the messiness of following through on non-for-profit, legal accounting and,
Hmm.
and such like
Hmm.
that. But as you said, like that's not actually what our call is. And I can also think of another part in the New Testament where Paul himself appeals to Caesar as an appeal. Like he didn't just sit there and go, oh, okay, well I guess I'm guilty because you said I'm guilty, right? He used that as an opportunity to say, well, I'm going to appeal this to Caesar, in the book of Acts. And so, I think you're right that we do need to kind of recover, the idea of the church militant as an approach here too. And perhaps, like, as you said, like there is a caution here, because again, I'm seeing, the emergence of maybe the other ditch, which is that, well, we're just going to go and we're going to do this. I don't know if you've heard of there's a big, you know, scuffle brewing right now in Tennessee about like this group that wants to set up a Christian community over there, and what is that going
Hmm.
to mean and everything. So I think there does need to be, again, thoughtful conversations and consideration in light of Scripture, in light of looking at church history on how this should be handled. But we at least have to have that conversation, not just dismiss this outright and say, well, this can't be done. Right? It's beyond the pale. So
That's right.
yeah. And so I'll end it there. I wanted to just offer, though, is there anything else that you want to share with our audience, just to kind of close out before we say our goodbyes? Anything else that's happening, anything we can pray for you on? Just I'll leave the floor open to you on anything you want to share.
Well, I would just thank you for the opportunity to talk and think through some of these things with you, out loud, and to ask people to pray for revival, to come to New England, to come to Connecticut, to come to my church. We're seeing growth. Um, and I think a lot of it has to do with just me being willing to be bold in my proclamation of the gospel, and to apply it to real life, real world examples. And that's obviously made me a target. And so I would just ask for prayers for protection for my family and for me, and to continue to discern what God calls me to do, and to be faithful to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I love that you're asking for that. As I said, I've been to New England a number of times. Actually, Connecticut's the only place on the Eastern Time Zone I haven't been yet. So I've been within 3 miles, and I probably have to correct that at some point. But it's a beautiful part of the country, very rich heritage. Again, like I know you brought up Edwards. I went to his church in Northampton. Similar
Hmm.
situation where they got the historical plaque there. He was a mighty preacher, and there's the rainbow flag right behind it. Right,
Right,
so
right.
it grieves me a lot that's what's happened there, and so definitely, you'll at least have a few prayers here in Texas to that end continually, and I encourage anyone else who's listening to this to to petition our Lord and ask for the same thing as well that Pastor Jacob's saying here. But thanks again, Pastor Jacob, for joining us. Last thing is there any way that people who are interested in following your what you're doing up there in Connecticut, your church, is there any way that they can follow you online and continue to
Sure.
see your story?
So I'm at firstchurchwoodbury.org is the website for the church. My sermons are on my Substack, which is Experimental Sermons. And then my Twitter X handle is Jake Dell at Jake Dell 73. So those are probably the best ways to find me. First Congregational Church, Woodbury, Connecticut. Put that in and you'll find me.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thanks again, and hope